should receive the minutes from the January 19th and the January 20th meetings. Is there a motion or are there any changes to those minutes? Representative Helgerson. For both days? Seconded by Representative Rajas. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, the minutes are approved. Committee, at your place settings, you'll have a copy of the enlarged version of the State Federal Relief Funds allocation tracker document from the Department of Administration's update yesterday, and it's been distributed to you. Are there any bill introductions this morning? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and move on to the item that we're going to discuss today, and that is going to be the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. And so right now to committee, I would invite the Secretary of the Department of Labor, Amber Schultz. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chairman. We appreciate the invite this morning. So with me today, I have Deputy Secretary Peter Brady, and he's going to be giving an update on the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Peter?
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. As the Secretary said, my name is Peter Brady. I am the Deputy Secretary here at the Kansas Department of Labor. I have a brief but dense presentation on the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, so I'll run through that and we'll be happy to address any questions that come up as well. So you'll see on the first slide here in our presentation just kind of an overview of what the trust fund is. It's the monetary fund that holds all of the employer taxes paid by employers for the unemployment insurance system. One important thing I would note is that throughout the past 2 years, we've had 7 different unemployment programs in the state of Kansas. Only the state unemployment insurance program is funded out of the Unemployment Trust Fund. The other 6 programs are all funded from the federal government. So when we talk about all the benefits that were available in 2020 and 2021, only 26 weeks of state benefits paid out of this fund. The remainder were all allocated from the federal government. And I'd note too that as we entered the pandemic, the state of Kansas actually had one of the healthiest trust funds in the country as a measure of solvency. We'll get into how that's measured here in a minute. But because of that, we remained cash flow positive throughout the course of the pandemic. I'd also note that in the last session, the House Commerce Committee ran a bill and did a lot of work that put additional measures in place to ensure the future solvency of our trust fund. And why that's important is because throughout the course of the pandemic, there were 19 different states that had to take out a Title VII loan from the U.S. Department of Labor because their trust funds reached a point at which they no longer had enough money to pay benefits. So when that point is reached, the states are forced to take that loan to remain solvent to pay benefits, and there's longer term financial implications that I'll get into a moment. So the next slide that you have in front of you here is a graph with 3 lines. You'll see 2 lines with a generally downward slope. Those are 2009 and 2020 respectively. And then you'll see the 3rd line, which starts lower and starts to build up with some significant steps in it. That's the 2021. That's the tracking of the balance over the course of those 3 years. So what you'll note too is that that top line, which is 2020, as I kind of mentioned, we entered the pandemic with one of the healthiest trust funds in the country. So you'll see a generally similar slope from 2020 and 2009, with the key difference being we entered in a much healthier position in 2020. And as many of you know, later on in the Great Recession, the state of Kansas did have to take out that Title VII loan I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which had to be paid back. There was interest associated with that. At one point, the state had to go into the Pool Money Investment Board to satisfy obligations there. So what I'd say is that some of the reforms that went into the trust fund in 2013, 2015 are what put us in the place we were in 2020 that allowed us to enter in a much healthier position. So in terms of trust fund solvency, the agency reports on the solvency every year on a fiscal year basis. So on December 1st of every year is when we certify for the previous state fiscal year. And we use something that's called the average high cost multiple. I'll get into that in a moment. That is how USDOL wants states to measure the solvency of their trust fund. And December 1st of this year, what we determined is that because of the impact that's been on the trust fund, there's not enough benefits to cover the average cost of our 3 highest years. And that's 2009, 2010, 2021. Now, that is to say that if we entered another recession type event, pandemic, and we had to pay out at that significantly higher level that we did in 2021, 2020, 2009, 2010, we might not have enough money in the trust fund to cover 12 full months of benefits. What I would also note, though, is that where the trust fund is today and the current economic outlook, there's no reason to believe that we wouldn't be able to continue to meet the obligations in the current economic environment. But the solvency measure is supposed to look at what is the potential worst case scenario in which a state would need to prepare to pay that level of benefits. So on the next slide here, I'll kind of get into a little bit of the technical piece of how we do that calculation and measure that solvency. So like I said, the measure we use is called the average high cost multiple, which is the ratio of the reserve fund ratio over the average high cost benefit rate. Now the benefit cost rate is basically the amount of benefits the state pays in a year over the total wages paid into the system. And when we calculate the average high cost multiple, what we do is we look at the last 20 years of benefits paid, and we take the 3 highest years. We take the average of those 3 highest years as kind of what is a potential worst case scenario, and then use that against our reserve fund ratio to make that calculation. And on the next slide, you'll see we have 2009, 2010, and 2021 as those 3 highest years, giving us an average high benefit cost ratio of 1.244. On the other side, you'll see that reserve fund ratio I mentioned, which is the other component of the average high cost multiple. And then on the next slide, what you'll see is that calculation, which is 0.986. 1.0 is the key number in terms of trust fund solvency. If you hit 1.0, what that ratio is telling you is that for 12 months, you can pay out that worst case scenario of benefits. Obviously, we want to be a little above 1.0. Part of the reforms that went in during House Bill 2196 is solvency adjustments that occur for the employer community. So once the state gets up to 1.25, which is showing a solvency that could pay for about 15 months of benefits, employer tax rates start to go down incrementally. Basically, the thinking here is that as the trust fund becomes more solvent, as employers have done their part to replenish that fund, tax breaks are given and we need less money going into the fund to remain at that higher solvency level. And as I said, that 0.986 basically says we could pay about 11 months of the worst case scenario as we stand today. We will be having first quarter contributions coming in April of this year. And those of you familiar with House Bill 2196 will know that there is a potential for an additional $250 million in ARPA funds, depending on the results of the audit related to unemployment fraud that occurred during the pandemic. So the agency will continue to monitor this very closely. But what I would also say is, given the current unemployment rate of 3.3%, and at least at this time, no indicators that there's going to be a substantial recession, there's no risk in the trust fund going insolvent until an event like that were to occur. And then committee, there's 2 other slides that just show the graph of initial claims and continued claims looking at last year compared to this year. As you'll see in this report, and I know our government affairs team sends out weekly updates to the legislature as well, the volume of claims at the agency is substantially lower than it was last year. To simplify it, we're basically at the pre-pandemic levels at this point in time. And then the only thing I'd wrap up with to Mr. Chairman, for anybody that's interested in trust fund solvency or seeing a state-to-state comparison, the U.S. Department of Labor every February releases a state unemployment trust fund solvency report that evaluates all 53 states and territories that administer a program based on the health of their fund, any outstanding balances, and kind of what their future obligations may be. I mentioned that 19 states had to borrow over the course of the pandemic. About 40 states or territories either borrowed, infused funds from ARPA or CRF, or did a combination of the two to keep their trust funds solvent. There are some states, I know there was a presentation yesterday in House Commerce that kind of talked about the dire situation some states were in. There's one state with almost $20 billion in loans out from USDOL. 5 states entered the pandemic with outstanding loans from the Great Recession. So I just want to reiterate again that the work of the legislature in 2013 and 2015 really did help us enter this pandemic in a much stronger situation, and we've fortunately avoided many of those pitfalls. With that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes the presentation I have. I'd be happy to stand for questions. We have a few members of our team here as well to assist me.
All right, thank you, Peter, for describing exactly what the status is of the Unemployment Trust Fund. Obviously, one thing that I would like to touch on is during the pandemic, we had a lot of constituents. I think everybody in this room had received emails from individuals who were having some situations in trying to get their unemployment benefits. On one of those was the fraudulent activity that was occurring, and I've been contacted by some constituents that they are now receiving fraudulent claims again. So can you please describe that situation?
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. So I'd say to the first part, there were absolutely challenges at this agency. I think where we are today is a much better place, but I also wouldn't say that we're 100% out of the woods or there's not still issues we're still working through with people. That's just the nature of the volume this agency faced and the tools we had to combat it. But like I said at the top, where we are today is unbelievably better than where we were this time last year. In terms of fraudulent claims, what we have seen over the past few weeks is newer attempts on the system. So just to provide a bit of background, going into the summer of 2020 is when we really started to see attacks on the federal programs and fraudsters realizing that there was these large amounts of money available and that data available through previous data breaches could be used for compromised identities to attempt to gain those benefits. And what we really saw was a sharp increase in the late fall into the winter of 2020, 2021, this time last year, of fraudulent attempts on the system. What the agency did was implement a system that uses ID verification and two-factor authentication to, one, verify the identity of a person filing a claim, and then two, once that identity is verified, putting two-factor authentication on that account so that it couldn't be compromised. A good example of this is in addition to the imposter fraud or someone stealing someone's identity and filing benefits in their name, probably the most common fraud we saw during the pandemic, we saw a lot of what we call in the unemployment world claim hijacking, which is if I was a claimant and I filed a claim, I had my online portal set up, but then I fell victim to a phishing scheme, someone would log into my account, they would change the banking information to reroute my weekly claim to their bank account and steal my money in that regard. So the two-factor authentication addressed that. The ID verification addressed the imposter fraud, the stealing of information to file in someone's name. We saw a drastic decrease in the number of claims that went through the system once that security measure was put in place. I believe it was the last week of January in 2021. Now, that being said, the system is great. It's not perfect. We've seen that because we're coming around on the one-year anniversary of a large number of these fraudulent claims, what many fraudsters are trying to do is refile on the new upcoming benefit year of that claim. Some of them are getting through that first front door. What I would note is if you look at the numbers, you'll see that there's been a moderate increase in the overall number of initial claims, but the actual payment out of the trust fund has remained flat. So what that tells you is the initial claims reporting tells you how many total attempted claims have been filed, but it doesn't tell you how many have been paid out. If a claim is fraudulent and the agency stops it before payment goes out the door, it's reflected in that initial claims number. It's not reflected in the payout, obviously. The same would go for an individual who files for unemployment who is not qualified or not eligible for whatever reason. They would show up as an initial claim, but not as part of the payout. So we've seen, a bit of a renewed series of attacks on the state. To date, those haven't, substantially paid out. What I would say, too, that's been an important tool for our agency is, I believe it was September, the waiting week was reinstated in the unemployment insurance program. So during the pandemic, we waived the waiting week, which is the first week of any claim is non-compensable. It's a waiting week. And that was waived during the pandemic so we could get relief to individuals quicker. Since that has been put back in place, that just gives us that much more time to check every claim coming in, to look for fraud indicators, and to stop payment to anything that is likely fraudulent. So it's a situation the agency is still monitoring very closely. We're working on a communication this week out to the employer and business community to ensure, really to remind everybody, if you see fraud, this is how you report it. These are the tools we have available. The other thing I'd say, Mr. Chairman, too, is, we saw our attacks at that period in time. We never got rid of or, any of the tools we had prior to that. What we saw fraudsters do in the unemployment system is hop from state to state as different security measures were put in place. So after we put our security measure in place and we saw millions of attempted bots try to run through our system and get stopped at the front door, NASWA, the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, then started reporting that other states were starting to see these large number of claims hit them. And what we saw is basically fraudsters, fraud groups trying different things on different states. They've temporarily tried to come back to Kansas. To date, like I said, the number that's getting through is even very limited. We're talking compared to last year, moderate increase in claims. And the vast majority are stopped before payment ever goes out the door. But we're going to continue to monitor very closely.
And are most of these fraudsters, are they out of the nation or are they within the United States?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so that's a good question. From what we have available, and most of this information comes from the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General, it's been a mix of both. We know that there are criminal groups in foreign countries, specifically parts of Africa, parts of Asia, and Eastern Europe that have perpetrated these schemes. We also know, and there's been several domestic groups or chains that have been caught and are working their way through federal prosecution. So at this point, we'd say it's both. I don't know if we have enough information to say if it's more one way or the other, but we've seen both so far.
Well, I'd say the complexity of the matter is that when we would be contacted by constituents, they'd already be going through the process, and then they would be identified as fraudulent, and then they'd have to start the process all over again. And I think it was just somewhat cumbersome for those legitimate unemployment claims. And I know I had many constituents who were working their claim through the process, and then all of a sudden they were identified as fraud, and they had to start the process all over again. And they actually had legitimate claims, and it was just a very cumbersome process for those particular constituents of mine, and I'm sure everybody else in the room and also in the legislature had to deal with the same situations. Committee, are there any questions for Peter? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in 2020, Kansas was the #1 state for identity theft. And in the bill that we just passed last year, one of the items in there that we just talked about yesterday in Commerce was not just the multi-factor identification, but also the Kansas law enforcement identification. So if they have to use a form that goes through the Kansas law enforcement, the fraud that we're seeing now, the spike in fraud with bots or any computer-generated fraud would get stopped. It would just, wouldn't it, if we have this Kansas law enforcement identification requirement? Or perhaps you can explain.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Representative. So as part of 2196, one of the things that was added into the bill in the conference committee was the ability for a law enforcement office in Kansas, if they chose to opt in, to provide ID verification services to claimants that, I guess what we would call is caught in a fraud loop. And just to provide a little bit of context for the committee representative, prior to the placement of that front door I talked about, the identity verification, the multi-factor authentication, the agency was doing absolutely everything it could to identify and stop fraudulent claims. To put it simply, we were throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. While that did a good job of stopping many of the fraudulent claims, the unfortunate side effect is that there were legitimate individuals that got caught up in this. There may have been indicators on their account that are consistent with fraud, but it was a legitimate person that was trying to access benefits. The intent of adding that provision to the Bill 2196 was that if you were an individual and you just need your ID verified to access benefits, you could go to a local law enforcement office that's participating, verify your identity, they send that on your behalf to the agency, and we clear the fraud flag. But that is something that offices opt into and then claims to use to rectify that issue. In terms of how stuff can get through the front door, I think that was kind of the premise of your question, Representative. That front door, the ID verification, is really what stops the vast majority. It's like a funnel. But there are still fraudsters that attempt to find ways to get through that. And that's where all the other tools, our data analytics, our fraud flag searches, our work with the Integrity Data Hub from NASWA, all these other tools look at everything else that gets through and make sure that if there's any fraud in that, we're stopping it before the payment goes out.
Okay, well, that definitely clears it up, and I didn't fully understand who actually accesses the Kansas law enforcement for that. I wish it was everyone.
And just to, I guess, ask the question, because we have on our presentation that the trust fund balance as of July 31st, 2021 was about $656 million. What's the balance currently?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just pulled it. The last data I had available was the 15th of this month, and it was $668.8 million. What we're going to see here during the month of April is the first quarter contributions. So with the way we collect unemployment insurance taxes, the taxable base is the first $7,000 of payroll. So for the vast majority of employers, they pay somewhere from 80 to 90% of their contributions in that first quarter. So we will see an influx into the trust fund during April because employers have 30 days after the end of the quarter to file their quarterly wage report. If you look at the graph that I presented with the 3 different years and kind of the trust fund balance over time, in each one of those years, you'll see a bump around week 17. So that's the about 30 days after the end of the first quarter. And you expect to see that bump. Usually looks to be about 200 million, maybe a little more. So once we have first quarter contributions, we'll then do another assessment. We'll start looking at the end of the state fiscal year and this trust fund solvency. But kind of as I stated earlier, where we're at about 668 million is certainly a very good place given the economic conditions in the state today.
All right, thank you. Committee, any questions? Representative Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know this isn't commerce, but I'm not on commerce. I can see that. We'd probably still be there. Mr. Brady, I thank you for your numbers. I think a year ago, the atmosphere in this room was much different. I appreciate you and the Secretary actually physically being here. That sends a stronger message than I think you understand. Julie McGinney is one that has been, should be lauded. Whoever decided to hire her to work with us as legislators and working with our constituents. I know, I see her behind me. But, and I said I would probably say that, but I talked to the chairman. And I remember a year ago, a representative from Sedgwick and I volunteered our time to help the process if we could. And I know there's other things to it. But through all the numbers, there's still people. And many of us work till the job is done. And if that means for a few weeks we have to work 7 days a week and we have to miss Sunday dinner, we do it. Because this is what I'm hearing from my constituents. We just finally got one solved after about a year. And there's been so much miscommunication. I know it's gotten better, but it can be better. It must be better. These are people. These numbers are great, and I'm glad we're almost back to the point where we are. But in the bigger picture, in this situation, it's not political. We have to be a team. We just have to be a team. Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to go that way because I know we're talking about this trust fund, but I think the key word is trust. And we're dealing with real people. And I guess the frustrating part is when we do make that contact and we say, these are real people, I grew up with them, I knew them, yet it's still fraud. Now, if there's something that was a miscommunication, it's one thing, but the whole idea is trust Kansans. And then come to the legislatures who most of us know our constituents. It's not directed, it's not a personal anything other than I want to take that back, that we want to support you, but we can do this as a team. But thanks for all your efforts this last year as well, and I know it'll be another one, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I was going to ask if there was a question. But I do want to commend Julie McGinney because I know personally with all of the situations that I receive from constituents of mine as from the esteemed representative, and I'm sure all of us, I reached out to Julie many times, and I'm sure she was inundated with my emails and calls, and she was always very receptive and trying to get the situations taken care of. And so I do want to commend Julie for her work because I'm sure not only myself, but I think every representative and senator in this building had been contacting her in regards to constituent issues, and she was always very receptive, and the outreach to our constituents is greatly appreciated. So I want to thank her as well as Representative Rogers. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at the report and knowing that there is the uptick in the initial issues, I'm not sure if there's anything that you can share publicly and what you're doing to make sure that doesn't go out. But are there things that, to Representative Rogers' point, we can do together to make sure we don't get in that situation where we were the last time? And it is very hard to catch up once the claims, by the time I see that second measure, it's too late. That is not recoverable. And what things can we do, or what things are being done that can be shared to make sure we don't get there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Representative. If I could respond to that and the previous speakers as well. I'll start by saying yes, while the situation we are in today is generally better, and I tried to say this at the front, but I don't pretend to say that every problem is solved, that we're not still working through some of the cases. And I certainly recognize and look at cases every single day where it is a real Kansan that is facing a level of economic insecurity. And this agency, in many regards, and the system failed Kansans. That happened. That was part of the pandemic. There's a lot of work being done now to not only, one, understand what happened, but to chart the path forward. What I'd point to, committee, is that, part of House Bill 2196 was the formation of the Unemployment Insurance Compensation Modernization Council. And I know Chairman Tarwater is on that council. I know a few of your colleagues as well as business and employee representatives. We spent probably north of 100 hours over the summer and the fall discussing these issues in depth, analyzing a lot of what occurred and what we can do better, and working to chart the path forward. And what I'll say in general is that has been, at least in my opinion, a very successful endeavor in terms of bringing anybody impacted by these issues to the same table and having, more than just one day or a few hours to talk about it, but really a long, meaningful, long-form conversation. And I know that doesn't solve the issue of a Kansan that might still be pending some outcome today. What I'll say to that, too, is, as everybody on this committee has noted, Julie and Jessica and the government affairs team do an outstanding job of making sure to get those requests from you guys to work those constituent issues. There's also a large group of state employees who for 2 years have done nothing but fight a system doing everything they can to pay their fellow Kansans that Julie and myself work with to get that done. And it's been nothing short of incredible to see their efforts and their work. But Representative, to speak to one other part of that too, no one at this agency is stopping until every single issue is resolved. And the aggregate, I know that doesn't solve person A or person B issue, but we're going to continue to go through every single one until every case is closed out, paid, or otherwise reached its final resolution. Representative, to the second part of your question in terms of what we're seeing today, how we can work better together, I'll kind of speak a little bit broadly. In terms of fraud, I don't want to get too deep into the specifics, mostly because I don't want the other side to have our playbook, so to speak, on how we stop fraud. But like I said, the front door, identity verification, and then providing two-factor authentication to those accounts really is the first big step that solves 90% of, say, the fraud issues. The other 10, we still have all the tools we had prior to that, and we've enhanced those. We work with the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, their Integrity Data Hub, which compiles fraud data from all the states that participate. So if we're seeing data, information, or socials used in Maryland, Texas, Oregon, we can run claims in Kansas against that and see, you know, what if there's any overlap there, if there's any meaningful insights to gain. We also have data analytics tools we use to look at, and I'm couching my language a little bit here so as not to say too much, but we look at common identifiers that we would have seen in claims that are likely to be fraudulent, what other states have reported where they're seeing. An example I can give that I think is very public knowledge now is early on the pandemic, fraudsters realized that a Gmail email address, if you put periods in it, it will all be the same email address. So what they would do is have, say, 20 iterations of one email address, and it's all the same letters with a period and different points in the email address, and they all route to the same inbox, but that's a common thing, for example, that we'd see or an indicator that we look for. So, you know, even though we have a much better front door security system, as I've talked about, none of the other back end work that our team does every day to continue to look at the claims that are coming through, identify potential fraud has stopped. And in terms of your last question, Representative, you know, what can we all do to work together? I'll certainly speak for myself and the Secretary in that, you know, we've come to the Modernization Council over the course of the summer and the fall and here into the session, trying to bring as much information as we can to the table, working with the stakeholders, you know, working closely with the business representatives who have been immensely helpful in contextualizing some of the problems and assisting us with finding better ways to do it. You know, I would say conversations like this are what really helps us. And of course, the offer I usually make in these types of meetings, I'll make to anybody on this committee as well. Because I know some of you aren't on Commerce or Modernization Council and don't get to hear this information as much. My phone is always open. I'm happy to sit anyone down with me in my office across the street and pull up the mainframe and maybe better help some understand what the system we're dealing with today is and why modernization is going to be so important. So that offer is always on the table. I'm happy to talk to any and everybody.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Trying to get my head around some of the numbers that were there to get a handle on where we needed to be. I assume as I look at pages 6 and 7, those are all percentages of the total wages contributing by employers. Is that what I'm looking at? So the reserve fund ratio is 1.207 of the wages and each of the high benefit cost rates. And where I'm trying to get is back on page 4, we were looking at what our trust fund solvency needed to be. Would I look to that 9.86 or 0.986 as a percentage of total wages to come up with where I would want to be on solvency, or how do I was trying to get a handle on what is that target of money we want in that fund?
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So I'd say the target generally is 1.0 as the we are solvent measure. I think if you talk to most folks in the USDOL community or a lot of our employer representatives here in the state, they would say you'd want to be closer probably to 1.25, just in terms of having a little bit more solvency than 1 year. So 1.25 is probably the number you're driving at that average high cost multiple ratio, Representative. You know, in terms of that equation, the denominator, which is the average high cost rate, average from those 3 highest years in the past 20, isn't going to change for some time. So the question of, you know, how do you get to that solvency measure? It's really changing that numerator, which is the reserve fund ratio. You know, how we get there is continuing to build that balance in the trust fund, because that's going to influence that as the wage base grows slightly in the state. So to answer your question, Representative, you know, the track that we're on right now with the current employer tax rate schedule we have, I would anticipate the trust fund balance growing at a greater rate slightly than the employer tax base that's coming in, which is going to increase that reserve fund ratio, decrease that reserve fund ratio slightly, which will then in turn increase the average high cost multiple, which kind of gets us, one, I have no reason to believe we won't be above 1.0 when we certify for this next state fiscal year, but I think we can be much closer, about 1.2, 1.25, which gives us a little bit more breathing room in terms of solvency measures.
And if I've got my head around that at all, 1.0 would be 543 million in the fund, and 1.25 would be closer to 680.
So we're at, Representative, let me pull it back. At the last certification, we were at 656, and that's what we get that 0.98 from today. So 1.0 is probably going to be a hair over that. That's going to be, round numbers say 700,000 in the trust fund, which after first quarter contributions, I'd expect will be well past by the time we certify the trust fund. I could probably talk to our folks and get you some estimates in terms of what those thresholds are likely going to be for like 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2. We just have to run a few numbers.
Okay, thank you. And one other direction, if I may. In our pool of old claims that are still hanging out there, year plus, folks that have been trying, any idea how many are still there to try and get resolved, the size of that issue?
Yeah, and Representative, what I'd say kind of specifically for that pool, the folks that are still waiting that aren't new claims, but I'll call them pandemic era claims, they at this point in time fall into two buckets. There's individuals that are part of a fraud investigation that is more complicated than ID verification. That can be a lot of different things. Pre-pandemic, this is the type of fraud you'd see in the unemployment insurance system. Stuff like wage fraud, which would be I'm claiming unemployment, but then an employer reports wages under my Social Security. During that same time period, I'm claiming unemployment, and I didn't claim those wages. That's against the law, and that's fraud, so we have to investigate it. There's other instances in which individuals maybe provide falsified documentation to entitle a claim. So there's those what I'd call complicated fraud investigations that we are working through. We can get the number. We report it out to the Modernization Council twice a month on kind of open cases in that realm, but that's one. The other area, which I would say is a little more and probably where if you're hearing from constituents, at least what crosses my desk, most of these are, is the appellate system. These are cases in which someone has filed for benefits and they have been denied benefits and they are appealing that decision. Just like in a U.S. District Court, it is a bit longer of a process because we have to put together a hearing in front of an administrative law judge who will hear those facts and then determine whether or not to uphold the agency's initial determination or reverse that and then clear the claimant for benefits. So I'd say at this point in time, those are the two universes that exist today. Right now, we are hiring more of those administrative law judges to ensure we can hear more cases and get through that backlog quicker. The caveat is that you have to find someone with the credentials to fulfill that position and then also train them on not just the brutal complexity of the unemployment laws, but then all 7 programs that were active during the pandemic and all of their own sets of rules. So I hope that kind of provides a better understanding of what's left out there today. What I will say is that there's not a universe of claimants at this point in time who are waiting on something simpler than that. So like adjudications, for example, if someone's separation is in question, whether or not they quit with good cause or quit without good cause and would be entitled for benefits, those issues are all being resolved in a timely fashion, which USDOL standard is 21 days.
And circling back to the first response that you had in regards to the modernization project, if the committee would reference back to what I announced at the beginning of the meeting in regards to the federal relief funds that the state has. In the budget bill last year, we had indicated that federal funding would be used for the unemployment insurance system modernization project if available. And there's also a caveat to that, where this project is under review and may not be eligible for state federal relief funding. So can you kind of explain why that may not be utilized under the federal funds that the state has received?
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I can kind of speak to especially the USDOL specific parts. I know that the ARPA funds themselves have their own set of rules, and that's not necessarily my area of expertise. But I'll start by saying, in terms of funding modernization, there are a few existing sources of funds that would likely not cover the entire cost of the project, but get us off to a start. One example of that is the first attempted modernization that started about 2002 under Secretary Jim Garner. We received READ Act funds from USDOL. Those are special project funds to do things like modernization. There is still some of that money left available that we're hoping to use for this modernization project. There's also, some other types of funds. What this really comes down to, and what's been, frankly, Mr. Chairman, frustrating for myself, is in the ARPA Act, the Congress gave U.S. Department of Labor $2 billion under the broad heading of helping states modernize their system. When I speak to other state administrators, all of us are on the same page in terms of the first step in any modernization is getting states off of the legacy core processing, or what we commonly refer to as the mainframe. There's a lot of things you can do in terms of modernization. You can add a better phone system. You can add a better customer management system, stuff like that. But if you're still using a mainframe system as the core processing and payment engine, that's where you run into these problems. I think that sentiment has been expressed by many state administrators, myself included, to the U.S. Department of Labor. To date, they have not given any indication or plans of how that $2 billion could specifically be used to that end. And just for some context, committee, over 30 states have at least some component of their system on a mainframe. Kansas is almost entirely relying on the mainframe system. There are some states that have modernized the benefit side of their system, but are still on mainframe for tax and vice versa. So I'd say that, in terms of federal funds, that's what we would have hoped to see. What USDOL has done to date is they've established a Office of Unemployment Insurance Modernization under the Secretary of Labor. I believe they've hired the senior staff for that office, but I don't know that I've seen any news on that other than senior staff hiring. They did an initiative that was called Tiger Teams, which was teams of experts and consultants to go into the states to identify quick wins and assist with those, and that was going to be funded in part from those $2 billion. Myself and the secretary worked very closely with USDOL and requested to be on the first group of those 6. The thinking in my mind at that time was USDOL is going to spend money on this no matter what Kansas does, so we might as well try and be part of it and hopefully get some funding to fund some projects. We had that engagement this fall. We've got some recommendations we're working with USDOL on, and we're hoping to get some grant funding to kind of pursue some improvements. But Mr. Chairman, what I'd say at the end of the day is that from that pot of money that was allocated in ARPA, we have not seen any plans or a path forward and how that can be used to supplement states that just need to get off a legacy system, and that's priority 1A. I hope, does that address the question, Mr. Chairman?
It does in part. I'm just kind of wondering, obviously with the pandemic, we had an increased number of individuals filing unemployment claims, and so if you're modernizing the system, I'm just kind of questioning why that could not be used with the ARPA funds, if it's subject to approval.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, what I'd say is that is not my area of expertise, the rules in which the ARPA funds can be used. Obviously, from my point of view, I want to find any USDOL funds that are related that I can use. If those were available, that'd certainly be something the agency would want, but I just am not part of the recovery committee, that process, familiar enough with the rules of what they can and can't be used for.
All right, thank you. Representative Helgerson.
Well, the chairman's questions raise even more questions in my mind about all that. So, but I don't want to waste the committee's time because we'll be here for 30 minutes on that. Well, now, either you or somebody else schedule some time. Anybody can attend, but I'm going to go into that in more detail. First, I just want to say how refreshing it is to have somebody stand there and admit that we failed Kansans. Because we all feel it. And I hadn't heard that from the department, really, to the extent, or the executive branch, in a year. So I want to say first how much I appreciate that. Second, we realized how fragile our employees are and how well-trained they need to be in order to deal with the problems. And it's not something, we couldn't pump people in fast enough to deal with the overwhelming problems. Do you have a written strategy of what it takes to keep the employees there, to thank them, and to deal with the rehiring or the hiring from the burnout that I'm sure has to be going on in your agency? And this all should be going on, and I don't know whose budget it is, but is yours. I want to see this kind of a strategy because I don't want to have to I don't want to put state employees having to go through this kind of stress, and I want to try to solve the problem ahead of time. I have other questions, but let's start with that.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So part of I keep referencing House Bill 2196, but it did have a lot of components that are relevant here. Part of that was that the Secretary of Labor is to establish a surge staffing plan that encompasses the elements you were talking about. So that's something the agency's been putting together. There's two components to it that I'll touch on very briefly, Representative. The first is surge staffing. So when this happens again, how do we ensure we can get resources in as quickly as possible, address issues as early as possible so they linger for as little time as possible, right? That's the first goal, is how do you get resources in quick to cut that off? That's something that we are looking at in terms of, having contractors on standby or call centers available to quickly activate and deploy. In terms of the state employees, kind of our experts at KDOL, what I'll share with you, Representative, is your observations are correct. It was a very challenging 2 years for anybody at this agency who worked in unemployment insurance or any of the areas supporting it. I saw people work. I saw a dedication to service that I would compare to my time in the military in terms of trying to help their fellow Kansans. And the Secretary and I are doing everything we can to, one, show that appreciation, two, find ways to more than just show that appreciation, but build a better life for our employees here at the agency. And what I think is important for us too is, as we go from where we were this time last year in terms of volume and everything going on to how we move forward, is making sure we're building in those systems so that our employees, have the time to reset. Not an expert in this area, but I know that we all know how important mental health is and making sure that, we're rotating folks, we're getting folks breaks, because it was a breakneck pace for a very long period of time. But to answer your question about the in-writing part, that's all part of the surge staffing plan that the Secretary and I are putting together.
I've been around here a long time, and I have had a lot of secretaries and assistant secretaries and other individuals stand before me and, give me a response. And that's why I phrased that question. I want to see a written document. I want to see a strategic plan. I don't want to just have, as one secretary told me the other day, when I asked them if they had a specific strategic plan for deal with these problems, they said, oh yeah, we do. Is it written? No. I want to see a written strategic plan.
Right. And if I didn't clarify, Representative, that surge staffing plan that I discussed is a written one.
Okay. Second, you mentioned about past claims and the problems that we trying to deal with and all those, rectify all those. We also have a lot of people in Kansas that just gave up on those past claims. Do you have any strategic plan or plan of saying, hey, look, if we dropped the ball and you couldn't get through the phone for, 2 weeks or, whatever the problem was, we're opening this window for back claims or back problems to come back, and we'll look at them again.
Yeah, Representative, my guidance to the supervisors and managing the unemployment insurance system is to look at all of those on a case-by-case basis. We've said this before, talking about the complexity of unemployment insurance, but every claim is about as unique as a fingerprint. The circumstances, and especially in the pandemic, in terms of accessibility issues that many claimants faced. What I will say too is that throughout the entire course of the pandemic, knowing the challenges individuals had accessing the agency through the phone lines or other means, the agency offered a great deal of flexibility in terms of backdating claims that were filed because of those exact issues. So the guidance down to our team has been and will continue to be looking at the pandemic era, evaluate it on a case-by-case basis, look at what situation this individual may have faced and what the appropriate action is.
If I might continue.
You may.
Thank you. Some of those individuals never even got through the phone call to do the first application because they got so frustrated because they couldn't get through. So you're comfortable if I put out in my newsletter, say, here's a number, call them again. If if they weren't able to deal with your phone calls or problems, try them again.
Yeah, I'd say, and I'd caveat to say, please provide as much information as possible. The important thing I'd say to you, Representative, is we have granted that flexibility to the greatest extent we can, understanding the circumstance. There are still underlying statutes and regulations and USTOL policies we have to follow, but we also have tools at our disposal. So for example, if we know the phone number the individual had been attempting to call us from, we can pull and quickly see, yes, this person tried very hard and did not connect with an agent. And that obviously supports the case of, providing that assistance.
For the purpose of time, I'll hold the questions, but I'll just, later on, and you don't have to respond to them now, we'll talk about them later. Post-audit and the department had varying degrees of difference on fraud and et cetera. I want to get back into that more later. Have you returned, are the employees returned to work?
Yeah,
Are you fully staffed in the offices?
like all executive branch agencies, we began bringing staff back starting, I think, the first week in January. So we're in the process of doing so. We were doing, I guess, taking advantage of the work from home policy to renovate one of our buildings. That's finishing up now, so we're bringing those folks back in just a little bit later. But yes, like all executive branch agencies, we're in the process of doing that.
And in the process means they'll be back in by when?
I mean, we have a large portion of our employees back at our buildings today. I don't know if I have a date when everybody's going to be back. On a case-by-case basis, we do have a telework policy for some folks to be in the office some days, some to telework other days. Again, all under the guidance that's, through the Department of Administration for executive branch agencies.
Thank you very much for all your work. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative.
Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too wish to thank Julie McKinney because I think, like all of us in this room, I called her multiple times. And it was interesting because one day you would get one or two, complaints, and then the next day you could get 20 or 25, and I tried to figure out why. Then I realized if someone put on Facebook that they got help and boy, it was nice, then everybody came to you, And then I would say, well, I have to thank my source. I wasn't able to do this on my own. But I would have to tell you, there were times when I didn't know where to go. And I thought, I am calling her again. And I know everyone else is calling her again. When does this woman sleep? But I mean, she managed, but I just really publicly want to say, just like you all did, how much it was helpful to the constituent, but it was really helpful to us because we were getting all of those complaints. And I would get off the phone sometimes and I'd say, thank God for Julie. So thank you. My questions mostly were answered because I wanted to know, were they back in the office? And what kind of compensation did we give employees? If they were in a business, they would have thought about maybe giving them a bonus, or they would have done something for them personally to help them out. And I just think maybe we should, because they were doing this every day around the clock. And, thank yous are nice, but it's also nice to compensate them. And I wanted to know about old claims, and you answered that as well. My other question is, I see here 19 states have taken out loans from USUL to continue payment of benefits. Are those loan interest-free, or do they have to pay for those loans? And would that affect any kind of rating they might have, as in terms of not having enough cash to handle the situation?
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So that's a really good question, and it gets a little complex, so please bear with me. So in terms of the interest rate on the loans, if a state is meeting certain solvency measures and has certain requirements in their tax code at the state level that USDOL finds acceptable, those loans can be interest-free for up to 2 years. So for example, in Kansas, going into the pandemic, we evaluated to make sure that our solvency prior to the recession was in a good enough place, and our tax code had the provisions in place where USDOL would grant us interest-free for those first 2 years. One of the reasons that trust fund solvency is so important, and I talked about that average high cost multiple and getting above that 1.0 measure, is if USDOL measures your state as not being adequately solvent, when you get into that insolvency situation where you can't pay benefits anymore, you will not be extended those interest-free loans. On top of the interest that's on loans, the issue that begins to occur and that some of these states are going to start facing is that if you are not able to meet your payment schedule with USDOL for Title VII loans, what USDOL will start to do is decrease the FUTA tax credit. So FUTA is the Federal Unemployment Tax Act. That's the federal portion of unemployment taxes that employers pay. That funds really the administration of unemployment, both at the federal and the state level. Every state that is in compliance with USDOL measures gets a significant tax credit. So the standard tax is 6%. Any state that's in compliance gets a 90% or 5.4% decrease in that tax in the form of a credit. So their employers, and in Kansas, only pay 0.6% instead of 6.0. Obviously, that's a very important measure to employers. So, kind of everything I talked about with keeping the trust fund solvent and meeting those USDOL measures is important for that. So when a state gets into a position where they can no longer meet their financial obligations to USDOL, what the U.S. Department of Labor does is they start to decrease that tax credit, so take more taxes from the employers in that state, and they use the difference to pay back the outstanding amount from the state because the state isn't doing it.
Wow.
There's a lot of conversation that I won't get to in the weeds on in terms of how states choose to do this. I mentioned 19 states have taken out a Title VII loan during the course of the pandemic. I think 9 or 10 currently have outstanding balances with USDOL. The other 9, not all of those necessarily satisfy the debt in full. There are many states that have the philosophy of using other debt instruments to pay off USDOL before there's an interest, but they still have a loan or a debt obligation, somewhere else, whether they took out a bond or something of that nature. I'd say, Representative, kind of the point I'd use to tie together your question is the reason these solvency measures are important and that we made the reforms we did to the trust fund and the tax code is that if we run into a terrible scenario, we at least have 2 years of that option for interest-free loans available because we took these measures now.
Thank you much for that answer. When I looked at this, I thought to myself, it can't be good. I mean, it looks like, I'm having a problem with take a loan here. But anytime you take a loan, there's lots of strings attached to that loan. And I wondered about the credibility or the reliability or the validity of that agency. So thank you very much for your answer. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Ballard, did you also have a question about additional compensation or bonuses for the employees?
Yes. No, I was, it was mentioned earlier about, is there any kind of compensation that they get from all their hard work, and it's nice when people say, well, thank you very much. But it's like, if you really was appreciative, you would do something, along those lines. And I just wondered, are we in a position to do so? Is it legal to do so? Or is there something that we on appropriations can do to say thank you, because they were working on all of our behalf. They were working on behalf of all the Kansans, and they're all the time doing it. So I just feel that we should have something that we could do that would thank them for the time they put in on our behalf and everyone else in this state. And I don't know how we do that, but at least I want us to have a conversation, if possible, about how could we do that.
Well, the next individual that has a question is Representative Sutton. He's going to have the Department of Labor in his committee, and maybe that will be a discussion point that we have. But Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That really wasn't the question that I had right now, but you're right. That is a discussion that I think we need to be having when we're working the budget. In fact, I was actually planning on putting this off, but by golly, the magic word got mentioned, so I have to chime in. You mentioned surge staffing, and that's certainly a hot button issue with me in the way that it was handled previously. First off, let me understand correctly, because we're back to pre-pandemic levels, can I assume that we're no longer paying an out-of-state call center?
So Representative, we have drastically decreased, but we have kept on a small number of call center staff. I think it's around 25 to 30 from our contractor. The reason is, one, to make sure we're continuing to hit an answer rate that we feel comfortable with at the call center. We also did see some increases after the OSHA ETS, and then subsequently the special session in the bill, and then the process through our agency related to employment and vaccine mandates. So because of that new element and the increase in calls, we felt that it was prudent to keep a very small number. Now, you may recall that number of contracted staff was in the several hundreds earlier. Right. So by comparison, it's very small today, but there is still a limited presence.
And still out of state?
Yeah, the contractors.
Virginia, I think.
The contractor is supposed to preference Kansas applicants, but they can source from anywhere in the country, in the U.S.
Explain to me how that works exactly. Is this a call center, or is this a call center network of people working from home? How would that work exactly?
Yeah, so our contractor sources employees and runs a virtual call center, so they can source from anywhere in the United States as per our contract. But not, to be very clear, they cannot source from out of the country. It has to be within the United States. Well,
I guess that's a start. It just really kind of irritated me when I heard this was last year, don't worry, but when I heard that Kansans are out of work, so we're going to hire people from out of state to get unemployment to them. Gee, we could hire some of them in state, and then they wouldn't be unemployed. But it just seemed like we were not taking advantage of a resource that was available to us, i.e. a workforce wanting to work.
Yeah, and Representative, I'll caveat by saying that the initial contracting was before my time in this role.
Right.
So I was a part of this.
I'm not shooting at you.
But
it's okay.
but to address your question, many states followed the same model we did, which was using a contractor that sourced from across the United States. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, the uncertainty of where you could source labor from with the pandemic was a factor in that. Certainly, as I kind of mentioned in response to Representative Helgerson's questions, part of the surge staffing plan in 2196 that we're developing includes, identifying before the next event occurs what options and what channels are out there for us. And obviously a top priority of the Secretary and the agency is utilizing Kansas resources whenever available.
Excellent. That was going to be my follow-up question in your future plans for surge staffing, that we try to keep that close to home if we can.
Yep, absolutely, Representative.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Mr. Chair, I apologize. Could I briefly address the employee pay piece that came up? Because I would, Representative Ballard, to kind of the point you were making, I talked about what we're doing with our employees, Representative Helgerson. We were able to adjust and increase the standard rate for our frontline employees in the call center. I'm very proud of the work we were able to do there. We're also able to do some bonuses earlier in the pandemic. But I'd be very open to a conversation if there's an opportunity to do more in that space. But I did want to make sure I mentioned to you that did occur over the course of the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy Secretary, welcome back. I don't know if everyone knows, but Deputy Secretary had a new baby boy on November 18th, I think. Brooks Patrick. I had a picture of him. I sent it to Samuel if you could put it up if it's available. But anyway, he's just Peter's just getting back, so this is one of his first meetings. So take it easy on him, please. But congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Or thank you, Representative. I'm so used to the chair.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, that I was a little late, but I was handling a constituent's unemployment issue.
That's fine.
I was listening in, though, and I did hear your questions regarding fraud. And we received a report yesterday from Mr. Hayes. You probably were listening in. I know your people were there. But the fraud is increasing at an increasing rate. It is coming back, and I know you addressed it. However, the employers that were pulled, they immediately got back, like a few hundred of them got back within a few hours to the poll that was sent out to employers. And 56% of their claims are coming in on current employees. And I know that you mentioned that these could be people trying to reclaim under the same deal. But the multi-point authorization doesn't work if somebody enters their own cell phone. Like if a fraud person enters their own cell phone into your system, to verify that that's that person, is going to send it to their cell phone number or their burner phone, per se, and that's not going to catch them. Being that it's increasing at an increasing rate, and being that the state has already bailed out the fund once, there's got to be more that we can do to stop this. We can't wait for months and months like we did last time and cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. We need a plan. We know it's happening. What can we do to help you? We've got to stop it today, not tomorrow. And
yeah, so Representative, I spoke to Phil and a few others in the employer community last week, and they confirmed, much of what we're seeing on our end. I'd say, just to kind of clarify too for the committee, when someone files a new claim, they first go through ID verification part, right? That's the ID verification. Once that has been passed and their ID proofed, that's when they set up the multi-factor authentication. So that being said, if a fraudster is able to get through the identity verification portion, then they would set up the multi-factor authentication as you described, but it would require them to get through ID verification. What I'll say on that piece too is that while our ID verification system is very good, no system is perfect, and especially in the case of IDs that are very compromised, it's possible that fraudsters can get through that step.
yeah, if they have their credit report, they can answer the questions.
Yeah, potentially. And Representative, so what I kind of addressed earlier too was that all of the tools we had in place prior to the pandemic are still being utilized in terms of analytics. The one thing that has been very favorable for our agency this time around is that the waiting week is still in place, which means we have a week plus on each of these claims to evaluate and stop them before any money goes out the door. And while we're seeing a increase in a surge in the initial claims being filed, there hasn't been a change in week over week benefits paid out of the trust fund. So, that's obviously, and what I will say too is, we're working on a communication this week for the employer community as more or less a reminder for, how to report fraud, what to look for, and what to report to the agency. Because in many respects, the employer community is our frontline defense when they get that employer notice and they can report that to us. So, those are the tools that are in place, but, just to reiterate, Representative, the analytics we have on the back end, even if something gets through the front door, still was able to catch these, and we have that time period before payment goes out the door.
So if an employer gets notice of payment, that payment hasn't been made?
So when the employer gets the employer notice, the claim has been filed, that doesn't mean any money's gone out the door. Anytime a claim is filed, even if the claim is previously flagged for fraud for whatever reason, the employer is going to get that notice. But something that we'll clarify in our communication to be very clear to the employer community so that they understand that is receiving of an employer notice doesn't mean any money has gone out the door. It only means that an initial claim has been started.
Okay. I have a few other questions, if you don't mind, sir.
That's fine.
When one of our constituents, the gentleman I was talking to today, this morning, I really was, he needed to prove his identity, and he was having all kinds of difficulty getting into the phone line still. I helped him 2 weeks ago. He emailed me the documents, and I emailed them on to you guys, and he still hasn't been helped. He's done everything on his end. what is the delay when someone sends in the paperwork? And this isn't the only case. We've been told that the people that go to the sheriff's department, Representative Estes made an amendment last year in conference to allow these frustrated Kansas to go to the sheriff and give them their documentation and have the sheriff fill out a form saying, yeah, they are who they are. There have been people on the books for several months that went to the sheriff that haven't been paid yet, and some of them are being asked to go back to the sheriff and reprove themselves again. What can we do to expedite that? I mean, these are people that are waiting for payments that actually deserve them. So what can we do to expedite that process?
Yeah, and Representative, this is a part that's been challenging in that fraud takes many forms. And when someone has a fraud flag, that can mean many things. If someone's only issue is identity verification, I haven't seen issues in which it's taken longer than a few days at most to resolve the ID verification portion. A fraud flag can, especially if it's an older PUA claim, can really mean a in-depth fraud investigation is what is being waited on. That's certainly information that Julie can get for any representative that's wondering what this fraud flag actually means. Like, is it ID verification, or is there some sort of investigation that needs to occur? And to be clear, just because an investigation needs to occur does not necessarily mean that that individual is a fraudster. There could just be something that needs to be investigated. An example I might bring is that if someone claimed every week during Q4 of 21, for example, and we got the employer wage report, quarterly wage reports, and there were wages under that Social Security number, that could be wage fraud. Someone was claiming benefits while also working and not reporting that. It could also, in some cases, the way employers report their wages, it could be they were paid out a severance, or they were paid out accrued vacation, something like that, in which case it wouldn't be fraud. But it still needs to be investigated, because some of the cross matches we've discussed for fraud, tell us that if someone's getting paid from an employer but also claiming UI benefits, there's a potential fraud element there. As I kind of mentioned this earlier, the two buckets of issues that are outstanding longer than 21 days, which is our standard for many things in unemployment, are issues related to fraud investigation, like I was describing, and then claims that have received their initial determination but are currently in the appellate process. And just like a district court, that appellate process takes longer than kind of the standard determination. So does that kind of help clarify? I think the core of the question, Representative, was what can we do to help, or how can we more quickly move through those?
Well, if there's an individual that had their identity stolen, the second kind of fraud, and had a claim filed previously, they've gone to the sheriff to prove who they are, why would they have to go to the sheriff twice? And why can't we, while we investigate the fraud flag, why can't we get these Kansans paid in the meantime?
So, Representative, I don't know why they'd be sent to the sheriff's office a second time. We can certainly look at an individual case like that and the call recordings and see if there's some training improvement that needs to be occurred, if something was missed as that claimant talked to different agents. I would suspect that would be some of the case, so it's certainly something we can look at. In terms of, I don't think we would want to be in a position where we're paying benefits while an active fraud investigation is occurring that's not an ID verification. In other words, if we know that, we're looking at a wage investigation case, right, where we see wages reported in a quarter where the claimant claimed all the weeks in that quarter and didn't report earnings, that is something that is likely fraudulent. And under the statute, not only do those benefits have to be repaid to the agency, but repaid with a 20% penalty and then the subsequent 1 or 5 year fraud ban. What I wouldn't want to do and wouldn't want to put Kansas in a situation in which we kept paying those benefits and that individual was found to have committed fraud, because then there would be a much larger overpayment owed back to the agency because the result of that investigation was fraud.
He's going to be at Commerce later, so I can ask most of my questions then. But I do want to know the employees, when they were working at home. We all have seen how cumbersome the process is to pull up one screen and another screen and put them all together. When an employee is working from home, how do they do that? How do they navigate your system? Do they all have supercomputers in their house, or?
Yeah, we sent our our call agents specifically, and really anybody that works at the claim level of unemployment insurance, we sent them home with their laptop, 2 monitors, keyboard, mouse. When we initially sent everybody home in, early 2020. We sent them home with the full setup. We also set up virtual private networks for all of our employees that'd be accessing the unemployment system from not on site. But we were able to provide them with enough screens. And as the representative kind of alluded to, in our current legacy system, a frontline worker in the unemployment insurance system is looking at about 6 or 7 different programs and screens to evaluate a claim, to find the information they need to assist that claimant. So it's to the representative's point, extremely cumbersome at times, but we were fortunate enough early in the pandemic to procure what we needed to send them home with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll save my questions for later.
All right, thank you. Representative Estes, who's joining us by WebEx. Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on a few of the previous questions. Deputy Secretary Brady, regarding the sheriff's statements or ID proof, I'm seeing an increasing number of people being told that they need to go back and prove their ID. And I suspect that it's really beyond a training issue. One thing that we've all learned is this is a system that has many cracks. And I think that information is falling through the cracks. Information is not sticking with people's files. I also think that some of the people who are reproving their ID, somebody else is trying to prove that they're them, and they have everything they need from credit reports to answer the ID process. And I would like to know, is the agency willing to take immediate or as soon as possible action to get beyond a better ID process than credit reports? Because clearly that's not working for anybody.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. I'd ask if you wouldn't mind sending Julie and myself a sample of those claims you mentioned, because I would like to investigate those and see where the disconnect is or what occurred for as you mentioned, being asked to prove multiple times. That shouldn't be occurring, so I'd like to look at 4 or 5 of those and see what information we can glean from that. In terms of the ID verification solution, the solution that the agency utilizes is one of the 2 solutions that the U.S. Department of Labor put under its blanket purchase agreement for states to utilize for ID verification. There's another tool called ID.me that's used by about 27 states out of the 53 states and territories that administer unemployment insurance programs. What I'd say too is that there's pros and cons to both systems. I actually spoke with Mr. Hayes, who testified in front of the Commerce Committees yesterday, about a Bloomberg article about ID.me and some of the challenges that are arising with that. So what I'd say, Representative, to your question is myself and the agency are absolutely open to a better solution if one is available, and we're certainly looking to evaluate that. But I would note that the platform that we use is one of the 2 recommended by USDOL.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you for that answer. And speaking of cracks and things falling through the cracks, I still have a good handful of folks who told me, hey, I keep checking back. I keep getting told I'm waiting. Everything looks fine. 3, 4, 5 months. And I have a deep concern that you guys don't know what you don't know because of the flaws with the system. And I'm just deeply concerned that there's still a lot of people who aren't paid. There are times that I've asked you guys, can you tell me how many people are approved to be paid and haven't been paid yet? And you don't have a way to get that number. You can kind of do some mathematics and kind of figure out that number. And if you can't get that number, how do you know that you don't have people out there? And how do you find the people in your system that have fallen through the crack?
Yeah, and Representative had, kind of a few points on that question. First I'd say you kind of mentioned the approved but not paid. That's an issue that you probably heard me refer to in the council as claims maintenance. In other words, everything is in order, but the mainframe system doesn't have the pieces of data in the places it needs to be in order to process payment, and it requires manual intervention from a member of our staff that's knowledgeable on both UI and then how the mainframe system works. Those issues were longstanding for a while. We're at the point now where those are being resolved in 2 to 3 weeks once identified. So that's been tremendous progress on that front. In terms of the waiting, I would suspect that a lot of the claimants that you're referring to are in the appellate process. So in other words, they have filed the claim. The agency has made an initial determination, maybe denying that individual for weeks or a certain portion of their weeks. The individual disagrees with that assessment and has filed an appeal. And like I said, just like a district court process, the appellate process takes time to gather the docket, get that scheduled for a hearing in front of an administrative law judge, and then conducting that hearing and then issuing a ruling. That is the one area, as I mentioned earlier, outside of fraud, where we are working through a backlog. We're trying to hire more of those qualified staff to get through those hearings quicker. But by nature, it is a judicial appellate process, and that does take some time.
I'm done with my questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Representative Estes. I'm not seeing any other further questions. Representative Humphreys.
So just, I'm wondering if, thanks for being here, if you could give us an update on, when we passed in the special session, the religious exemptions, and there have been people that were fired. Do you have an update on the number of religious exemptions and if those people have come back to work and what's going on with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, Representative, I consider myself lucky in that my son was born like the week before the special session, so I missed it. So I'm going to defer to Secretary Schultz since I was out of the office up until recently.
All right, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. Well played, Peter. Thank you, Representative, for that question. So we went live with our intake system at the beginning of January, and so far we have about 150 folks that have submitted a claim. And with the legislation that passed, we are actively investigating those within 60 days. So that's where we are now with that.
So you're saying that the form for them to fill out a religious exemption you didn't have ready till the first week in January? Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, it was actually a very complex system that we put together. So for religious or medical exemptions, we had to be able to allow the person to submit forms, paperwork, other evidence supporting their claim.
But wasn't that part of our bill, was just that it was simple? They asked for a religious exemption? And that's it?
Yes, the intent was, I believe, to be very simple, but when we evaluated the legislation, there is a lot of complexity to it that we had to adhere to.
And so there's still people that are waiting to hear their decision if you've granted them an exemption or not?
Yes, we have 60 days to investigate the claim and provide a final decision.
And what was that number that you just?
It was about 150.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, any further questions? Not seeing any. Thank you, Mr. Brady, for being here, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here so we can have a discussion on the Unemployment Trust Fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, committee, we're going to have an update now from the items that we discussed and the recommendations from the Legislative Budget Committee that met during the interim. And so I'll now turn it over to Amy Deckard, the Assistant Director for Research Department. Amy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You should have the Legislative Budget Committee report at your place. It has a green cover for this year. I'm going to be starting on page 3 with the recommendations for the Joint Committee. The Joint Committee had a number of recommendations for updates that should be received by this committee as well as the Senate Ways and Means Committee. The first was a status on the foster care system as well as the implementation of the Family First Prevention Services grants. I might note that you received this yesterday. Also a report from the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation on the use of federal housing funds and possible first-time home buyers programs. Additionally, a report on the impact of the loss of federal COVID-19 pandemic relief funds on the budgets and the avoidance of creating a fiscal cliff. A review of the possible salary enhancements for community corrections officers relative to the adjustments made for the salaries in the positions of the Department of Corrections. A review of the temporary salary increase created by executive directive to avoid a creation of a spiral with the state competing with itself for employees. Report on the timeline for elimination of the moratorium on voluntary admissions to Osawatomie State Hospital and the status of youth mental health inpatient beds in Hayes from KDADS. A report on the bonded indebtedness of the state with consideration of what debt might be advantageous to be retired early from the Kansas Development Finance Authority. A report on deferred maintenance at the state post-secondary institutions, and the impact of the waiver application regarding maintenance of effort requirements in the federal COVID-19 pandemic relief legislation regarding K-12 and higher education budgets, the possible addition of funding to the Budget Stabilization Fund, and the possible addition of funding to the Appellate System to decrease unfunded actuarial liability. Additionally, the committee recommended that the Spark Task Force for Efficiency and Modernization Advisory Panel receive an update on the State House technology needs. And finally, on page 4, the committee further recommended that the Senate Committee on Utilities receive an update on the status of litigation regarding the natural gas rates during the 2021 extreme winter weather event from the Attorney General. And given the late hour, I will leave it there and answer any questions.
All right, committee, are there any questions for Amy? The only thing that I would add, and I see that Chairman Carpenter has stepped out, but in September, going back to the third item on what was recommended by the Legislative Budget Committee, but I see the ranking member is still here, Representative Ballard. I attended a Medicaid leadership series in Washington, D.C. with about 40 other states. And one of the things they prefaced in that meeting was the enhanced FMAP that has come from the federal government, making sure that states are using that appropriately and not having long-term funding with that, which could impact states when that enhanced FMAP goes away and causing that fiscal cliff. So that's something that this committee is going to need to analyze, as will the Social Services Budget Committee in regards to that, to make sure that we are not positioning ourselves in future years to having some budgetary issues. Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think so, and Chairman Carpenter is well aware of that. We have discussed that, so we will be monitoring that and also looking for guidance.
All right, any other further questions or comments? All right. Oh, Representative Rogers.
Quickly, I'm just going through this, and I will read this later. Are we expecting a class action lawsuit for Capers? Can you elaborate on that? I'm looking at this. It says in December 20th meeting, Executive Director of Capers said maybe looking for for legal services. Should a class action lawsuit be filed? Hadn't needed one for 15 years. Is there something coming down the pike that we're unaware of?
We have
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I would defer to the reviser to add additional information. However, under the State Sunshine Act, if a state agency has plans to put out an RFP for professional services, doesn't necessarily mean there is a lawsuit coming. It simply means that they want to have that contract in place. So this Legislative Budget Committee heard, I believe, 2 for potential legal services, one from Capers and one from the Attorney General. But again, I would defer to the reviser to add any additional information.
Jill.
I would just note that Capers, this is just a continuation of what happened 15 years ago. They anticipate if a class action would be filed, that the attorney's fees could be over $1 million, but they don't at this time anticipate anything in the pipeline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't mean to read anything into it, but I wondered after I start asking that question. If that was probably the case, it would just need to be renewed. So thank you.
All right, any further questions or comments? All right, seeing none, thank you, Amy. Committee, you'll know on the agenda that we are not having a meeting tomorrow because in the House calendar, we are pro forma, so we're not going to have a meeting. And we are also not going to have a meeting on Monday, January 31st. So our next meeting will be Tuesday morning, and I do have to make an announcement that due to a couple of phone malfunctions, we probably should have a breakfast buffet on Tuesday morning. So I would entice everybody to be here because the vice chair and also Representative Kincannon will be providing us with. So we anticipate a nice treat on Tuesday morning. So until then, we are adjourned.